Well, I don't know how many of you have seen the movie The Sound of Freedom. I'm not making a big plug one way or the other. It's one of those movies that's kind of gotten a lot of controversy around it right now. It's a really cool story, but if you're not ready for what's in the movie, it can be pretty disheartening and frustrating. But it's a great Christian movie, and I encourage you if you haven't seen it to go see it. But one of the things about it is it's about this guy by the name of Tim Ballard. And back in 2013, he was working for Homeland Security, and he decided, as he saw what was going on in the world, he saw these kids being taken into the sex trafficking world. And he wanted to do something about it. And so he left the government job and created an organization that is designed to help get kids out of this. And he goes all over the world. And at the time, the media praised him. The media thought, man, look at this guy. He is a hero. He is stepping out of politics, out of the government thing, and he's actually doing something to help kids. And 10 years later, a movie comes out about some stories that he's encountered, and all of a sudden the media is like, oh, he's just a conspiracy theorist. It's not real. It's interesting how our world does this, and there's a part of it that is so frustrating because when we hear what happens, when we see what happens, when we begin to understand what's going on in the world, we feel secure here in Dumas. But little do we know that the kind of things that are going on in the world are probably also going on really close. And when you hear these things, it stirs this anger inside of you, this frustration, like how could this happen? How could people treat kids this way? How could they do this? How could the media downplay it? Because we know it's happening. Here's the thing. I'm not here to talk about the movie or talk about that whole thing because honestly, the whole idea of the sexualization of everything has been so politicized and so twisted that we don't know up from down. And it can make us angry. But I guarantee you that every single one of us have the same thought in our minds and in our hearts. Where is God when this is happening? Where is this God that we see in the Bible that loves us? Where's the God that we just sang about that loves us when this stuff is happening? We might know people. We might have been through some awful, difficult things that just are unimaginable. And in those moments, what's going on in our hearts is, where's God? There are people all around us that are experiencing some of the worst things that we could ever imagine. And their question is the same, where is God? Where is this loving God that the Bible talks about? When I'm lost, I feel like I don't know what to do. Where's God? When I feel stuck, when I feel like this addiction has overcome me so much that I can't get away from it, where is God? When I'm suffering, when I'm sick, and there's no answers, where's God? When everything seems to be falling apart and I'm so overwhelmed and everything is up against me, where is God? That is the question that we all have wrestled with. If you haven't, I would question that a little bit. Because I think it's a very natural question for us as human beings to ask, where's God that loves us? But here's the problem with the question. The problem with the question is that it assumes that love means nothing bad will happen. Just ask somebody who's been married. Bad stuff happens in marriage. Your spouse says the wrong thing, or you do the wrong thing, or you say the wrong thing, or your kids drive you nuts. And there's things that happen. We assume that love means nothing bad is ever going to happen. We assume that love is absent of discipline when we ask that question. And again, it's a very normal question. It's a very natural question. It's a question that God wants us to ask. He's created us to ask that question, where is God? Because it means we're seeking something. But another problem with the question is it limits, it minimizes who God is. It minimizes him to what we can understand and what our experiences are. It's not that it's a bad question, it's just a shallow question. And as you think about where is God in all of this, maybe another way to think about it is, well, maybe what's happening for that individual or what's happening, what went on in my life is the only way that I would have understood that I needed a Savior? What if whatever that person is going through, or whatever you've gone through, was the only way that God could get your attention? Is that love? You see, the question, where is God when all this happens, is very limited. But it's not the last time, it's not the first time that we've had that question, and it's probably not the last. And what the psalmist in Psalm 107 does is he takes that concept, that question, because a little over 1,000 years before Jesus is even on the scene, he's asking the same question. But what he does is he gives a one-word answer that answers all of it. And then he begins to kind of break apart the key areas that every single one of us have probably fallen into in one way or another that we found ourselves in. We found ourselves lost. We found ourselves suffering. We found ourselves stuck. We found ourselves overwhelmed. And we're asking, where is God? And he takes that question, where is God? And he says, you're missing the point of who God is. And so if you have your Bibles, I'd love for you to turn to Psalm 107. It's a 43-verse chapter. We're not going to hit all 43 verses. We'll hit a good chunk of them. But one of the things I love about this is it's not just about God. Listen, catch this. Everything in the Old Testament is about Jesus. If you look at it through that lens, you begin to see things that you've never seen before. If you read the Old Testament, if you read this psalm with the absence of who Jesus is, it can sound like, well, that's good for them, but it's not good for me. But you and I get the opportunity to look at this through the lens of what Jesus did for us on the cross. And ultimately, what the psalmist is writing about, 1,000 years before Jesus is even on the scene, he's talking about Jesus. And he begins in verse 1. Look at what he says. And right away, he gives us this word. He gives us this concept, this idea, this characteristic of God that is so essential to answering that question, where is God? Verse 1. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His faithful love endures forever. Some of your versions might say his loving kindness. That word loving kindness is a massive word. It's the theme throughout the whole thing. Throughout this whole psalm, that is the theme word. That is the key idea that he's trying to get across. God's loving kindness. In a couple verses, he's going to kind of give a word picture for us to kind of get in our heads of kind of like if you envision a map, right? And in the middle of the map is loving kindness. But because of the different things that happen in our lives, we go different directions. Some of us go north, some of us go south, some of us go east, some of us go west. And we find ourselves wandering and being lost or being stuck or suffering or being overwhelmed. And so we struggle, and he says that the whole concept of God's loving kindness is to bring us back to, it's what we are to focus on because it brings us back to who God is, and it reminds us that when we feel distant from God, he really does love us. Just because I'm going through this bad thing doesn't mean he loves me any less. And there might be something that he's doing through that situation. He wants us to focus on God's goodness. He wants us to focus on loving kindness. So I just want you to take that word for a minute. And I want you to just kind of envision it, think about it, let it marinate a little bit. What does loving kindness mean to you? It's a weird word. We don't use that very often in our English language. It's made up of two words, love and kindness. What does loving kindness look like? What does it feel like? What would you think it is? What would you feel like it is? How would you experience loving kindness from somebody? In the Hebrew, the word loving kindness is the word hesed. Hesed. It's a Hebrew word, hesed. And combined with the word God, it's hesed Adonai. It's God's loving kindness. The idea behind it is what the psalmist is talking about. And this is what embodies Jesus Christ. It's this kind of love that is a covenant commitment that God, it's who God is. It's this covenant commitment of, it's his character. He is not going to not fulfill his covenant. And so this love is a covenant commitment that God makes with us, with any who follow him, because he loves us, because it's who he is. And he sticks with that commitment no matter what. It's the commitment. It was impossible for us to fulfill our commitment to following God. Just think about this last week. What are the ways in which you didn't show God that you loved him? It doesn't take long. We start thinking of those things right away, right? And yet, he keeps his commitment because it's who he is. He keeps his covenant with us. His Hesed Adonai, we are connected to God in his loving kindness. And that, even though it was impossible for us to keep the commitment, catch this, it's impossible for him to not keep his commitment to us. That should stir something inside of us, an excitement. The kind of the word picture when the Hebrew language was first kind of being written on paper, and they kind of used some hieroglyphic type of things to kind of describe this. The picture that is given is of a person bowing their head in mercy and kindness towards somebody else. In our language, it would be somebody sticking out their neck for somebody else that doesn't deserve it. That is the picture of God's loving kindness, that he's sticking his neck out for you and I, even though we don't deserve it. And he's going to do it, and he's going to continue to do it because that's who he is. It's a beautiful picture. And so when we think of this Hesed, this love, it's not just him sticking out his neck for us, but it's also this redeeming love. There's this crazy story in the Old Testament of a guy by the name of Hosea, a prophet. And Hosea has a wife by the name of Gomer. Gomer is a terrible name for a woman. I have a dog named Gomer, and if you've ever watched Andy Griffith, you know Gomer Pyle. It's a terrible name for a woman, and yet in the Bible, here's this guy, Hosea, who's married to Gomer. And Gomer decides to leave her husband and become a prostitute. And God talks to Hosea, and he says, Hosea, I want you to do something. First of all, I want you to forgive her. Second of all, I want you to take everything you have, everything that you seem to think of value, and I want you to sell it. I want you to use it to buy her back and make her your wife again. And it's a weird story because it just doesn't make sense. How could God expect somebody to do this? And yet what God does is he tells Hosea that this is the picture of the people who say they follow me when they turn against me and they do things that they know are not right. That they become adulterous. And he's really talking about Israel, how Israel has become adulterous. They've turned to other gods. They put other things in front of God. And so he gives them this picture. And he says this in Hosea chapter 2. He says this. And this is what he's telling Hosea to say, to believe, but this is really what God is saying to us when we have turned against God. And this is because of his loving kindness that he can say this. I will take you to be my wife forever. I will take you to be my wife in righteousness, justice, love, and compassion. I will take you to be my wife in faithfulness, and you will know the Lord. And on that day I will respond, this is the Lord's declaration. Down below at the last part he says, and you will say, you are my God. God's loving kindness is not just the story for Israel, it's a story for you and I. This Hesed Adonai, everyone needs this kind of love. And what the psalmist does next, as we're going to see, is he breaks us into 4 different kinds of people. And every single one of us can fit into at least one of the 4, if not many of the 4 or all the 4 at some point in our lives or another. Let's go into the passage a little bit. Look at verse 4. This is that first section. This first section, he's talking to those who are stranded, who are wandering, who are lost. If you've ever felt lost, see if this makes sense. See if you resonate with some of this. Some wandered in the desert, in the desolate wilderness, finding no way to a city where they could live. They were hungry and thirsty, and their spirits failed within them. The picture is that these people are looking for what their soul and their heart thirst for. Some of these kids that went to camp this week, they didn't realize that they were hungry and thirsty for Jesus. And it took them going to Not a desolate place, but kind of a beautiful place, Estes Park. But it took him getting into this place where they could see who God is. And in this moment, look what happens. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he rescued them from their distress. He led them by the right path to go to a city where they could live. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his faithfulness, for his loving kindness, and his wondrous works for all of humanity. See, these are people who are lost, who are wandering. Think of it like this. These are the kind of people that go from job to job. They go from relationship to relationship or marriage to marriage. They go from place to place. They're always looking for something. They're never satisfied. They're never finding what they're looking for. They keep looking for it in all the wrong places. And they keep finding themselves searching and searching, and they seem to never get it figured out, and they seem to never get what they're looking for. And it takes them to be completely lost and in this desolate place, in this desert, feeling like they cannot find it anywhere else for them to notice God. They are brought into this reality that they need God. What's crazy about Psalm 107 is it connects with Mark chapter 4, 5, and 6. In fact, if you look at the stories in Mark chapter 4, 5, and 6, each one of the stories match up with parts of Psalm 107. In Mark chapter 6, verse 30, right in there, Jesus is feeding the 5,000. And the concept there is that there's these people who are hungry and thirsty. They're hungry and thirst for righteousness, and they're hungry and thirst for what Jesus is saying, but they're also been out there so long, they're getting hungry and thirsty physically. And what does Jesus do? He meets their needs when they need it the most, and he feeds them, and he replenishes them. You see, if you feel stranded, God promises to provide for you. It may not be when you want it. It may not be when you're ready for it. It may not be when you expect it. But he promises that. The second group, verse 10, are the sentenced, the rebellious, the imprisoned. If you've ever felt stuck in something, like you can't stop doing something, like you've ever been addicted to something, if you've ever felt like you are just, your decisions have created such consequences that you can't get out of it, that you are experiencing the consequences of whatever decisions you've made over and over and over, you know what this feels like. Look at what it says, verse 10. Others sat in darkness and gloom, prisoners in cruel chains, because they rebelled against God's commands. Notice why they're where they are. It's because they've rebelled against God and despised the counsel of the Most High. So what does he do? He breaks their spirits with hard labor. They stumbled, and there was no one to help. And it took him to get to that place when they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. He brought them out of darkness and gloom and broke their chains apart. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his loving kindness and his wondrous works for all of humanity. These are the ones who are hostile and rebellious to God. They make choices that they think are going to be just fine and they can handle them, and they find out that the choices that they've made are just not about freedom, but imprisoning them, entrapping them into a vicious cycle where things just continue to fall apart and they get stuck. They are hopelessly ignorant and foolish. And so what does God do? He lets the consequences play themselves out to the point of breaking them from their rebelliousness and humbling them. Mark chapter 5, there's a story there of a man who's possessed by a demon. Now, we don't know the whole story behind it, but the belief back then is the reason why this man is dealing with this is because at some point in his life, he turned against God and he started serving other gods and he started pursuing other gods, and he became possessed by a group of demons, actually. And so what does Jesus do? He sees this man who is suffering, and he's at his end. And he's been pushed out by society, and he's been rejected, and there's no hope for him. And Jesus heals him and sends the demons away. It's a great story. It's a great reality of what Jesus does. There's a third group of people, the suffering. These are people that are sick. The Bible word would be afflicted. It's kind of a big word, afflicted. If you've ever felt afflicted, if you've ever felt like whatever you're dealing with, it's not necessarily your fault. It could be. It could be that you're dealing with some type of sickness because of decisions you made, but it might be just because what sin does is makes us sick. Here's what he says. See if this fits you, starting in verse 17. Fools suffered affliction because of the rebellious ways and their iniquities. They loathed all food and came near to the gates of death. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. You hear a pattern. You see a pattern, right? Look at this. Look at what happens in verse 20. This is really interesting. He sent his word and healed them. Somewhere else where the word is sent to heal. Maybe John 1, and the word became flesh and dwelt among them. That word is Jesus. The writer doesn't know he's talking about Jesus, but he's talking about Jesus comes and heals them, or that God sends his word to heal them and rescued them from the pit. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his loving kindness and his wondrous works for all of humanity. These are the ones who are sick physically, emotionally, mentally, even deeper spiritually. They are fearful, they're nervous, they're anxious. Everything seems to not be working. They can't understand what they're going through. It doesn't make any sense. They don't deserve this. And here comes Jesus. There's a connection to this in Mark chapter 5, where a woman who is afflicted, she is dealing with this bleeding issue, and she's constantly bleeding, and nobody can stop it. And so in that society, because she's got some kind of weird disease that they don't know what to do with, she is rejected by society. She is not allowed to be around people or anything. They don't want to get what she's got, and they don't want to deal with her, and so she just left by herself. And there's nothing more lonely than to be sitting, to be around people that are supposed to love you and care about you, that are your people, and yet they don't want anything to do with you. They won't talk to you. They won't look at you. And what does she do? She sees and hears that Jesus is coming, and so she slips into the crowd, and she just touches the hem of his robe, and she is healed. You see, over and over, God comes to those who need it. There's a fourth group, the sinking, the drowning, the overwhelmed. Look at verse 23. See if this fits any time that you have felt or that connects with you. Others went to sea in ships conducting trade on the vast water. They saw the Lord's works, his wondrous works in the deep. He spoke and raised a stormy wind. So here's the scenario that he's kind of picturing. He's trying to paint a word picture for us. These are the kind of people that they've got it figured out. They've got everything under control. They know what they're doing. They know who they are. They have been gifted for this moment. They have always been able to succeed. They've always been able to do what they need to do. They've always been able to handle the situation. But then God brings along a storm that they cannot handle. Look at this. He spoke and raised a stormy wind that stirred up the waves of the sea, rising up to the sky, sinking down to the depths. Their courage began melting away in anguish. That's a strong word there. They reeled and staggered like a drunkard, and their skill was useless. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper, and the waves of the sea were hushed. They rejoiced when the waves grew quiet, and then he guided them to the harbor that they longed for. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his loving kindness and his wondrous works for all humanity. These are individuals who are agitated, desperate. They're in trouble. They got trouble in over their heads. They are overwhelmed by whatever's going on. They can't handle it anymore. There's another time in Mark chapter 4 where you've got a group of disciples who are pros on boats. They live on boats. That's their job. They've been on stormy seas, and yet they get into this moment that they can't handle it anymore, and in their distress, they cry out to Jesus, and what does he do? He calms the storm. Wasn't on their time, wasn't when they wanted it, but it was just in time. You see, the picture of God's loving kindness is so huge that it reaches every single one of us, no matter where we are, no matter what we've dealt with. It's all around us. And the writer says this, basically, that you may not be experiencing his loving kindness in this moment right now, but you have experienced it because you can see it in the people around you. There's very few of us in this room, only about a handful, that went to camp and got to see God's loving kindness work through the lives of young people. And yet, we can think back on that. We can hear the stories. We can have conversations with the kids that went and hear the stories from them that tells us that God's loving kindness showed up when we least expect it. But it's always on time at the right time for the right purpose. And so in the worst moments, Hesed Adonai, God's loving kindness shows up because it's who he is, and it's the covenant he's made with us, and it's the promise that he's made. So no matter what our condition is or what we feel, the writer is telling us to depend on that Hesed Adonai. Look at verse 43. He ends by saying this, let whoever is wise pay attention to these things and consider the Lord's acts of faithful love. If you're wise, the challenge is the same. If you're wise, you won't focus on your situation and the difficulty of what you're going through. It is real. It hurts. It's awful. It's terrible. It may be because of decisions you made. It might not be. It might be a storm that God has raised for a purpose. It might be because you have made some choices that have got you stuck. But in the middle of those moments, God's loving kindness has not stopped. And you can see it in the people around you, and in the experiences, and in the lives of other people. And that should stir a hope within us. And if you're wise, you will focus on God's loving kindness and how it showed up in everyone else around you and in other people and other stories. If you're wise, you'll take your eyes off of you and you'll put it back into that center to who God is. He is a God of loving kindness. And so the same call for all of us, the challenge is to give thanks to the Lord for his loving kindness. You see, his loving kindness is why he stuck his neck out for your salvation. His loving kindness is why he stuck his neck out for your redemption and reconciliation. He paid the price to take you out of your adulterous life and bring you back into relationship with him. He stuck his neck out and he sent his son to die on the cross. And then he stuck his neck out again and sent his Spirit to dwell within us and to help us in our biggest times of need. The purpose of his Holy Spirit is to comfort us. You can rely on God's loving kindness no matter what. That loving kindness of God was fully displayed when Jesus opened up his arms and died on a cross for you and I. So when you feel stranded, when you feel stuck, when you feel like you're suffering, when you feel like you're sinking, the challenge is to focus on God's loving kindness. That loving kindness that really began at the cross for each of us, we can look back at that. For the writer in Psalm 107, he doesn't know what Jesus is going to do. He has no concept of what's going to happen. And yet in the middle of what he's going through and what he's seen people go through, he can see God's loving kindness showing up in so many ways. God's loving kindness has brought you to where you're at today. It's no accident that you are here this morning. It's no accident that if you were a student and you went to camp that you're here this morning. It's not because it was such a great week. It's because God's loving kindness showed up in your life and you can't wait to worship him. The reason why you're here today is not because somebody invited you or because it's the thing to do. It's because you have ultimately experienced God's loving kindness in one way or another. And maybe this week has been one of the worst weeks of your life. Maybe you've had one of the worst lives of anyone's life. And yet when you look around, God's loving kindness is showing up time and time again. At the end of each section, if you go back and read this psalm, at the end of each section, there's a call, there's a challenge. And in verse 22, it says that we are called to bring sacrifices of thanksgiving and shouts of joy because of his loving kindness. In verse 32, it says that we are to exalt, or the word today, or in our culture today, would be to applaud. When somebody does something amazing or that catches our attention, there's this clapping, there's this applauding, there's this cheering, there's this stirring inside that you go, okay, I got to tell you that's amazing. And everyone around me needs to know that what happened is amazing. It says to exalt him in the assembly, when you come together to exalt God in front of everyone because of his loving kindness. The only way we can do that is if we pay attention. The only way we can do that is if we look around and we consider what God has done, and then we give back to him what he deserves, and that is praise. So we're going to sing a song again here in a second that I asked Adam to come back to. Because I think it's the heart of what this passage is of God's loving kindness. And I've thought this, and I've said this a couple different times, a couple different ways, but you can tell what a church believes by what they sing. You can tell what their theology is by the songs and the words in the songs. But you can tell if a church really believes it by how they sing. Do you really believe that God's loving kindness has shown up? Have you seen it? Have you experienced it? Do you believe who God is? If it is, he has done great things. And that's not something to be silent about. It's something to celebrate. It's something to assemble together and say, God, you have done amazing things.